Thanks everyone for joining us this evening for this panel discussion on Russia's war in Ukraine. I'm David Clingingsmith, Associate Professor and Interim Chair in the Economics Department here at CASE. And with me today are our three CASE colleagues. Kelly McMann is Professor of Political Science and an expert in democracy and the politics of post-communist states, which of course include Russia and Ukraine. Ken Ledford is Associate Professor of History and Law and Chair of the Department of History. Ken's an expert in 19th and 20th century European history. And furthest to my left is Roman Sheremeta, Associate Professor of Economics and the founding rector of American University, Kyiv, a new university whose prospects looked very much in jeopardy a month ago, but not so much today, which is a great thing. So as you all know, a month ago today, Russia invaded Ukraine, its Western neighbor and fellow former member of the Soviet Union. This war was ordered by Russian President Vladimir Putin without provocation and justified by false claims that Ukrainians do not exist as a people distinct from Russians, and that an illegitimate Ukrainian government that was run by Nazis were persecuting Russian speakers. So a completely false justification. It looks now like the initial goal was to replace the democratically elected government of Volodymyr Zelensky with a puppet regime that could be controlled by Putin via conducting a rapid attack on Kyiv that failed. And so that plan both overestimated the capabilities of the Russian military and underestimated the will of the Ukrainian people to fight, as well as the capability of their military. Putin's prosecuted the war in a brutal fashion with direct targeting of civilians and their homes being the main tactic since the failure of his attempt to oust Ukraine's government early in the war. This makes the conflict distressingly reminiscent of Russia's wars in Chechnya in the 1990s and more recently in Syria. Overshadowing the conflict is the specter of nuclear weapons. Both Russia and the West, of course, have enough large enough nuclear arsenals to destroy human civilization, and this is their most direct and dangerous confrontation in many decades, perhaps even since the Second World War, depending on who you talk to. And while efforts are being taken to avoid direct engagements between Russian and Western forces, both by Russia and by the West, there's no guarantee that that an escalation won't happen. Today, the conflict appears to be stalemated with some Russian progress, but no decisive end to the conflict in sight. Russian soldiers digging in outside of Kyiv and being pushed back in some places. Tens of thousands of people have already died, and more than 10 million Ukrainians, or around a quarter of the population, have been displaced from their homes because of the fighting, some leaving the country altogether. So before we turn to the remarks that we have and your questions and comments, I'd like to ask that we observe a moment of silence for those who've been killed in this unnecessary and brutal conflict, and also for the millions of people whose lives have been traumatically displaced. So first, we're going to hear from Professor McMann, who's going to talk to us about the pressures that Putin is under to end the war, both domestically and internationally. Then I'll go through some of the economic effects of sanctions, which has been a significant element of the response by the West, and one that is now being felt globally and will probably be felt even more strongly in the near-term future. Professor Sheremeta is going to talk about Ukraine's prosecution of the war and the terrific progress that they've made. And last but not least, Ken Ledford is going to talk to us about the long history of insurgency in Ukraine during the 20th century and what prospects that might hold for the future. So we'll each talk for around 10 minutes or so in order, and then after that we'll have 50 minutes or so for questions and discussion. So go ahead, Kelly.
Just an idea.
Do you think so? I'll...
Good evening, everyone. So while pressures on Putin to end the war are significant, they are not likely to be successful in the near term. Successful either in terms of encouraging him to end the war or removing him from office and having someone else come in who ends the war. So I apologize in advance for sharing a pessimistic assessment, but I think it's important to understand for our understanding of current events. So I'm going to talk about pressure within Russia and then from outside of Russia. From Russian citizens, we're mainly seeing now and likely to continue to see protests by prominent individuals, such as Olga Smirnova, a Bolshoi ballerina who recently resigned and left Russia over the Russia's war in Ukraine. There have also been other prominent artists and many journalists who've done similar personal protests. We're also seeing anonymous protests now in Russia. No war stickers have been going up on buildings and public transport in Russia. We've seen some small street protests, but mass protests by Russian citizens are unlikely for a number of reasons. First of all, many average Russians share one of the rationales for Putin's staging of this war, and that is an attempt to allay their own concerns that the West is encroaching on Russia. Besides sharing this rationale, average Russians are not receiving accurate information about that there's actually a Russian war in Ukraine. There's also been a significant increase in repression against protesters in Russia. And many of the individuals who would most likely be activists or at least go out for street protest have actually left the country. Now, of course, it would be helpful to mobilize for mass protest if there was an opposition leader who could do so. But right now in Russia, there's no influential opposition leader who is free. Pictured here is the leading opposition figure, Alexei Navalny. His prison sentence was just extended. Also, over the last couple of years, his organization has really been decimated by the Russian government. He had developed an organization to investigate government corruption and also to mobilize the population for protest. So now he needs to resort to issuing directives to his supporters through his attorneys and through social media, which seems to be less effective. It's possible another influential opposition figure could emerge, but during this current period of severe repression in Russia, it would be difficult. Often we've seen in countries around the world that business elites can play a role in changing policy and removing leaders of countries. In Russia, the leading business elites are referred to as oligarchs. It's more likely, though, that the oligarchs will continue to exit than to protest. So we see that when business elites have an exit option, meaning that they can earn income overseas, they can have their family overseas, they can have their bank accounts overseas, that they're less likely to demand change in their own home country. Despite all the economic sanctions, which David Clingingsmith is going to speak about in detail later, despite these economic sanctions, they still have exit options. One of these is Dubai, that is not enforcing sanctions, and many Russian oligarchs have property there, and there's a Russian oligarch and broader Russian community there. It's unlikely that the West will pressure Dubai to impose sanctions because Dubai is an important military and intelligence partner for the West. Another group within Russia that could potentially pressure Putin to end the war or remove him from office are the Siloviki. So Siloviki are the leading political elites in the country. These are current and former security officials. But the Siloviki seem to share Putin's objectives, and they also have economic incentives to support the regime. So these individuals, many of them served in the KGB in the Soviet era with Putin, or in St. Petersburg local government in the early 1990s with Putin. So many of them share his views because they have shared experiences through that. They're also of the same generation, so they have shared everyday lived experiences. They've also benefited enormously from Putin's renationalization campaigns. So these Siloviki, these political elites, also now control a lot of the oil, aviation, shipbuilding, and banking industries. So they have incentives to see the Putin regime stay in office. Now, moving outside of Russia, first of all to Ukraine, the Ukrainian military has really mounted a very impressive defense, which my colleague Roman Sheremeta is going to speak about in more detail. That said, it's not clear that that military defense is going to be sustainable. What's really important is that Ukraine can sustain its air defenses to provide cover for its ground operations. Currently, Ukraine is down to 55 fighter jets remaining, and it's only able to fly 5 to 10 missions per day versus the 200 missions that Russia is flying in the country each day. I think I'm more optimistic about the Ukrainian resistance. I think that the resistance can endure long-term because it has numerous advantages. First of all, by the Ukrainian resistors, whom I mean are those civilians who've joined the Territorial Defense Forces, which is the volunteer branch of the Ukrainian military, but also those average citizens who are just resisting through their everyday activities, such as sewing camouflage nets and things like that. Now, compared to past resistance movements in other countries, the Ukrainian resistance movement has quite a few advantages. First of all, there's a really strong will to fight. And I think this is very well evoked by this photo, which is of parents who have just joined the Territorial Defense Forces saying goodbye to their toddler. So to me, that really demonstrates a very strong willingness to fight for your country. The stakes are really high. Ukrainians are afraid that they're going to lose their country. They also have a very rich history of resistance, of civilian resistance. And Roman Sheremeta and Ken Ledford will speak both about the psychology and the history of the Ukrainian resistance. Another key advantage to the Ukrainian resistance is there are many veterans as well as military officials who already have experience fighting the Russian military. Talking to colleagues in Ukraine, they will say, well, we've been fighting the Russian military for 8 years because that's when the military came in and took territory and engaged, supported the separatists in Eastern Ukraine. So that experience can be helpful. Another advantage is that the Ukrainian resistors have external sponsors, primarily the US and Europe, and nearby states, primarily Poland, where they can be resupplied. An international force that could potentially put significant pressure on Vladimir Putin is NATO, but I don't think NATO is likely to expand its tactics. What Ukraine really needs from NATO is air defense, as President Zelensky's made very clear. NATO has been slow to craft a plan to send fighter jets to Ukraine, and it might not happen at all. And the concern is that Russia is a nuclear power, and there's concern about engaging it too directly in military support. So in conclusion, I'd like to talk about a few end to war scenarios. I'm not advocating these scenarios. They're just two possibilities out of many, but I think they're worth considering. For either of these scenarios to occur, there need to be some changes in conditions, current conditions, and also I think quite a bit of time would have to pass for either of these scenarios to play out. So the first scenario is that Ukrainian resistance, coupled with the international economic sanctions, devastate the Russian economy to even a greater extent than they have so far. The Ukrainian resistance is bleeding the Russian economy because it's requiring continued funds toward the military effort in Ukraine. Coupled with this is the possibility that average Russians would begin to receive accurate information about the deaths of Russians fighting in Ukraine and also about the brutality toward Ukrainian civilians. This potentially could cause mass protests to erupt, the combination of the economic devastation and the accurate information and the disgust over that accurate information. The final step to this scenario would be that the Siloviki, those leading political elites, would possibly also suffer personal economic losses from the devastation of the Russian economy, and also may be unwilling to use widespread, very brutal violence against mass protesters. They would defect, the Putin regime would collapse, and potentially a new leader could come in who would be willing to end the war, considering all these potential pressures in the country. So that's one possible scenario. Another possible scenario is that the Ukrainian military, resistors, average civilians, and government feel like they've just reached the limit in terms of devastation in their country. Now, Ukraine's already experienced horrific devastation, but there's the potential for more and the likelihood of more. Right now, there's no sign that Ukrainians are anywhere near that limit in terms of their psychology and their thinking, but there is that possibility at some point they will feel like they've reached that limit, and the Ukrainian government will decide to grant concessions to Russia. That would lead to a peace agreement. Frankly, I'm not very confident that a peace agreement would be upheld by Russia. So that may be just a temporary or a sham end to the war. Thank you very much for listening. I'll turn over the podium now to David Clingingsmith, who will talk more about economic pressures. And I look forward to your questions and comments later. Thank you.
So the primary responses of allied countries to Russia's war in Ukraine have been economic sanctions and the provision of weapons. More than 30 countries have participated in each of these responses. I'm going to talk exclusively now about sanctions. So an economic sanction is an action that one state takes to affect the policies or the actions of a second state. By causing economic damage to the second state or its citizens. While many types of sanctions have been imposed so far against Russia, I'm mainly going to try and talk about the aggregate effect of the most important ones, of which I think there are two. So over the past few years, Russia's central bank accumulated a roughly $650 billion war chest of foreign currency assets that it could use to insulate its economy from the effects of war. These assets, which you can just think of as stocks or bonds or even bank deposits, they're held in overseas banks. And the idea behind this war chest is that if a war happened and investors decided that they wanted to flee Russia and sell assets that are held in rubles, depressing the value of the ruble, the central bank would have all of these foreign assets that they could use to buy ruble-denominated assets and prevent the value of the ruble from falling. And that's very important because if you keep the value of the ruble from falling, you keep imported goods cheap. And imports are very important to the Russian economy. So early on in the war, the Allies coordinated to deny Russia's central bank access to this war chest to use. So it's just sitting there frozen and unable to serve the purpose that it was built for. And that looks to be set to cause three quite serious, related and simultaneous economic crises: a currency crisis, a financial crisis, and possibly a sovereign debt crisis. This central bank sanction action was unexpected, never tried before, and looks to have been extremely powerful, although that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be particularly effective, at least in the near term. So when access to the war chest was cut off, the value of the ruble fell by about 50% and has since rebounded a little bit, now is about 20% below the level it was before. And so this kind of abrupt fall in the value of a currency, if it has negative economic effects, we call that a currency crisis. So you remember I said that imported goods become more expensive when there's a currency crisis. And these are the goods that the Russian economy imports. You'll note that important ones, so big boxes on this slide, include machinery and vehicles. And these are widely used in domestic production and distribution within Russia, even though they're not necessarily consumer goods. They're sort of contribute to the production and distribution of consumer goods. So we can expect that domestic goods in Russia will also become more expensive over time, through these increase in cost of these intermediate goods. To support the value of the ruble, to keep investors from sort of rapidly selling off their Russian assets, the Russian central bank raised the interest rate by about 2 times to around 15% to try and keep investors in ruble-denominated assets, so like ruble-denominated bonds. And because higher interest rates also slow economic activity domestically, a side effect of the sanctions are going to be a severe recession in Russia. The increased riskiness of Russian investments, the likelihood of recession, sharp rise in interest rates on bonds, all combined to cause a big collapse in Russian stock prices by about 50% so far. That's a big fall, so on the order of the dot-com crash in the United States in 2001. There's also been runs on banks, so it seems legitimate to call this a financial crisis. The difficulty that Russia has in accessing these foreign reserves are going to make it hard to make payments on government debt, which are usually made in foreign currency. And so this could lead Russia to default on its public debt, which is something we call a sovereign debt crisis. That makes it harder and costlier for the government to finance its debt in the future. And so when you have these sort of 3 co-occurring crises, you can generate a substantial fall in economic output, which is kind of the goal of doing something like this. And so the Banking Organization Institute of International Finance has estimated that Russia's GDP is going to decline about 15% this year and maybe a further 3% in the following year. Those are Those are very large declines. They seem consistent with what economists have estimated from financial crises in the past. And I think that even if the sanctions are lifted quickly, say if there's a settlement to the war and that's part of the settlement, it's still going to take a long time for this crisis to sort of work its way out. A fall in GDP of 15%, that's about the same as the fall in GDP in the United States during the first year of the Great Depression. If you think about it in terms of conflict, it's larger on an annual basis than German reparations after the First World War, and in fact are nearly as large as the reparations that Russia imposed on Eastern European states after the Second World War. And so two sort of points kind of come out of that. One is that we have sort of done something that's very large and aggressive in defense of Ukraine, and we need to, I think it's important that we acknowledge that we have involved ourselves in this conflict to a very significant degree, and the fact that we're not directly engaging in combat operations, could kind of mislead us in understanding the degree to which we're already a party to the conflict. Nevertheless, even though these sanctions are going to have a very large effect, it's unclear that they are going to be realized and have an influence on the policies of the Russian government in time to have a big effect on how on the outcome of the war, at least within the next year or so. It's unclear that it would have an effect. It's also, I think, unclear even in the longer term, given the power the Russian state has to reorient the economy toward war production, and potentially the ability it has to stifle dissent domestically through repression, and so which would make it able to engage in that reorientation of the economy, which would be very hard on civilians and therefore probably require repression to work. There we go. So oil and gas are a large fraction of Russian exports, and Europe is the biggest customer. Russia is also one of the most important sources of European oil and gas, and so both Russia and Europe are very interdependent with one another in this market. And that's led to some exceptions on the sanction regimes regime as far as oil and gas purchases are concerned. And so one effect of that, which is sort of illustrated in the right-hand figure here, is that it appears that Russia has been able to earn a large amount of foreign currency this month, which may have to do in part with the increase in oil and gas prices as a result of the conflict. So it's possible that this oil and gas exception, and so this is related, I think, to the rebound in the value of the ruble from 50% down to 20% down. And so it's possible for, the overall revenue that Russia earns from selling petroleum to actually rise if the prices of those two commodities increase sufficiently. I think the second, so I've talked a lot about the central bank sanction. I think the second sanction that's likely to be very effective are those that target strategic commodities. So for example, if Russia is going to decide to manufacture additional arms, it's going to need semiconductors for the control systems. Russia has no domestic semiconductor industry, so it needs to get them from abroad. And building such an industry domestically, particularly for semiconductors, is very hard. It's extremely expensive to set up the fabrication plants. And so efforts to prevent access to these kinds of strategic materials could be very very impactful, but again, in the future. So there's also been significant effects on the prices of commodities. So wheat prices are almost double what they were last summer. Ukraine is a large supplier, as is Russia. And there's an expectation that the sown area for wheat and corn in Ukraine to fall by about half this year. And so that's both, both a significant loss of income for rural Ukrainians, also that will also rebound in poor countries that rely on Ukraine for as a sort of seller of them to wheat. We also have seen crude oil and natural gas prices rise very significantly, sort of contributing to the problems with inflation that we've had in both the United States and Europe recently. And so I would expect that that's going to lead to a more rapid tightening of monetary policy in the United States and potentially trigger a downturn here. Another interesting effect, energy related, is that European states have announced some ambitious plans to speed their transition away from oil and gas. And so there's a sense, I think, in which the Europeans realize if they're going to deal with Russia more effectively as a geopolitical foe, they're going to need to be actually less integrated with them economically. So more broadly, I think the actions taken as a whole have sought to deintegrate Russia from the world economy. And that sort of raises this question about whether this era of globalization and integration, which we've seen as very positive because it can prevent conflict, now it's preventing Germany from being as involved in this conflict as it might like to be. So integration can cut both ways, right? And so it's unclear now how states are going to respond to this new environment as far as their, attitude towards globalization was. And so, the world economy, you can see in the slide, was fairly tightly integrated in 1914 before the First World War, and did not become as integrated as it was then until the 1970s. And so conflicts between world powers have resulted in deglobalization before, and there's a question about whether that might happen here. So thanks very much for listening. Look forward to your questions, and we'll now turn the podium over to Roman.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone who came to spend this evening with us and to talk about probably one of the most significant and important events of our century. I will talk right now about military, about Ukrainian military. And as you can see from the title, my view on this is a little bit more optimistic than Callie's view. Why are Ukrainians winning the war? So here is the this is the table or the graph that shows the losses that Russia has incurred in almost 20 years of the war in Afghanistan. That's pretty much equivalent to what they've lost in less than a month in Ukraine. So you will understand Russia has lost right now almost twice as many troops and vehicles and tanks that the US has lost in the 20 years of war in Afghanistan. So you will understand the numbers, the gravity of these numbers. The Ukrainians, again, the Russian Komsomolska Pravda recently published this number, which they took down right away, that by their own admission, they lost more than 10,000 soldiers, and then they took it down. And so, but of course, internet is not forgetting these things. And so we were able to capture this. Today, the first US intelligence conservative estimate was about 7,000 of Russian soldiers that were killed. But here's the thing. Today, again, the NATO gave a report that they believe that Russia has lost about 15,000 troops, and about 40,000 troops are either wounded, captured, or dead. 40,000 incapable troops right now in a month of war in Ukraine. And of course, there is other independent different sources that they track the military vehicles that have been destroyed, and they literally look at all the videos and all the photos that are available, and then trying to use the algorithms to determine which one are unique. And basically, just for the photos that we have right now, it's almost very interesting number, 1666 vehicles have been destroyed, Russian vehicles have been destroyed in Ukraine. It's about 500 tanks, so you will understand the colossal losses that Russia has incurred. And this is the second mightiest army of the world in photos. The photos on the left, as you can see, those are the Ukrainian tractors that are picking up some very expensive Russian equipment and tanks. So I guess the farmers are fighting as well. On the right, I've found this photo just recently in Kherson, the top corner on the right, that's the vehicle from the First World War and the machine gun from the First World War that is been seen spotted in Kherson. And of course, you probably have seen photos like this from the American press, from The Guardian, that literally you have convoys of Russian vehicles that are just burned and their guns. So the bottom line is that Russia has incurred tremendous losses in just 1 month of this war. And the question is why? Why is this happening? How come that Ukraine was able to put such a fight while the prognosis from Russia was 3 days? The prognosis from CIA and from the United States was 3 days. And now we have more than a month and Russia is losing. So the question is why, and this is something that is very fascinating to me as well, because I'm an economist who studied conflict and war, and even wrote pieces on this topic. So one of the reasons is incentives. There is a very famous incentive effect that has been documented in this literature on war and conflict, and that is that the level of fighting is going to increase as incentives increase. I mean, any economist here will understand this is a very simple principle. And so the question is, who's going to fight harder? What are the incentives here for Ukrainian army? These are the incentives. It's the children who are now asleep in bunkers. It's 120 Crips that have been put on Lviv, that have been killed in this war. That's what Ukrainian army is fighting for. What are Russians fighting for? They don't even know what they're fighting for. They're demoralized. They don't know what they're doing. Some of them are running and just giving their weapons. Now, I'm not saying that there is no people, no Russians that are doing this for money and this, but again, the incentives are clearly very different, what Ukrainians are fighting for and what Russians are fighting for. Another reason is, let's call it identity. Ukrainian people are as united as ever in their history. The nation that is supposedly divided by language, by culture, by many other attributes is now stands as a monolithic unit, and all fighting for the freedom and independence of their country. They had an experience of 2 Maidans. They had 8 years of experience fighting against Russia that has united them even more so. And I mean, this lady is my hero. Her name is Maria Mikityevna. She's a 94-year-old Ukrainian woman who survived World War II. And she gave, this month, she gave 3,000 out of 4,000 hryvnias of her pension, 75% what she had, to Ukrainian military. So you'll understand that's $100 out of 130. And that's, I would say, an average Ukrainian. People have such a strong identity, and they are defending their country. They are united as one. Another reason is the war tactics that Ukrainians are using that are akin more closely to guerrilla warfare. The Ukrainian forces are not going head to head with the tanks like 50 tanks versus 50 tanks. No, that's not how they fight. They fight in the groups of smaller groups of 10, 20 men, and those men have a very capable. They are very capable. They've been trained very well through the 8 years of war. And these smaller groups are very effective against larger groups. They can go from behind the line. They can stop the convoys. They can let 50 vehicles pass by and then blow up the bridge and then just kill everybody who is in between. So they've been extremely effective. And this is the kind of war that, Ukrainians are used to, and they can fight this war indefinitely. Now, the last reason, the fourth reason that why Ukraine has been so effective at fighting this war against Russia is the allies. This is a picture that I have of, if you know the biblical story of David and Goliath. But the one thing that this is a story that behind David, there is God who is helping him to fight against this bully that came against the Israel nation. And I do believe that God is in Ukrainian side, but I also believe, and we know that Ukraine has allies in the face of United States, European countries that have put together the resources and have really helped them to overcome this discouragement effect. And this is very famous effect that I have studied in probably a dozen of my own works. Then when you have a strong player going against the weak player is discouraged and gives up very quickly in an uneven battle. That didn't happen in Ukraine. In fact, somehow this weak player became a very formidable fighter. And so this David stood up to the test. And one of the reasons is, again, we've leveled up the ground. And this is what is so important for the United States to continue to do, and also for the world, is to provide Ukraine all the necessary resources to fight this battle. And especially javelins, the ANLAW, the Stunga, Ukrainian tank weapons have been extremely effective, to an extent that Russia actually completely halted on their advancements. They were not able to take any of the major Ukrainian cities. And in fact, today, Ukraine has started to push the forces back around Kiev. They pushed about 30 kilometers away from Kiev. So now in some areas, they are on the offensive. And so, losing the war, Russia is using very inhumane tactics that already are being acknowledged as the war crimes and crimes against humanity today. And so Russia soldiers are instead attacking civilians, buildings, children, hospitals, schools. That's their enemy right now. They want to demoralize people. The military is not anymore objective. And so as a result, you see pictures like this, that people are buried just in lines. You see buildings. This is Europe. This is Kiev, Kharkiv. And of course, you cannot forget that it's individual lives. It's people that are being lost every day. Somebody's mother, somebody's child, somebody's father, grandfather, grandma. This is what's happening today. And so the question is, what can we do to help Ukraine? Well, we need to continue our support as a country, both in humanitarian and military support. Right now, as we've heard from Callie and from David, and this has been an ongoing cry of Ukrainian people to close the sky. I'm not advocating to put boots on the ground, but the anti-aircraft equipment, airplanes, these are the things that we can send and not being directly involved in the war. I mean, we are kind of directly involved anyway. Our anti-aircraft and anti-tank missiles are killing Russians every day. Every day. The reason Ukraine was able to put the fight because of in a big part of the American equipment. So what's the difference? I really don't understand this policy of we can send this equipment, but not this equipment. So again, this is something the United States have to act very quickly in order to save those children and women and civilians. The economic sanctions have been very effective, but as David pointed out very clearly, the revenue for gas and oil actually increased because of the prices. That's what happens. You restrict the quantity, the price goes up, and so the revenue can actually increase. And so one of the ways to do it is we need to stop this business as usual with Russia. We need to have completely refuse imports of Russian gas and oil, not only in the United States, which we've done, but also in the world and especially Europe. And I hope that as the gas season kind of going to go down, the demand for gas is going to go down. Europe is going to be able to quickly restructure their supply of gas, so they will be able to stop those supplies. Finally, the last thing that is as important is we need to stop any spread of, sorry for the word, maybe inappropriate, but it's a Nazi Russia propaganda. And you see the Z is here to differentiate because that's the swastika that they're using today for promoting their war. And so we've seen this propaganda on both on the right and on the left, on the side of Democrats and Republicans, and this has to stop. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There is no secret labs that have manufactured COVID. I mean, the last information that I've heard from State Duma, Russian State Duma parliament, that Ukrainians have manufactured COVID-19 with the help of Americans, and that was the beginning of the pandemic. That's spoken from the parliament of Russia. So this is just absurd. There's no bioweapons in Ukraine, and President Zelensky is not a dictator. Putin is. And period. This is something that has to be spoken very clearly, and we need to fight this propaganda. Now, I want to end on these words. I'm going to read them. These are the words that I actually wrote to President Biden in my letter to him. I wrote 2 letters, and for one of the letters that I wrote to him, I even got a response from his office, signed by Biden. I don't know if you read it or not, but I want to read this to you. These days, we are often hear reference to the World War II, in which Hitler killed millions of innocent lives. After the victory over Hitler, we said never again, a phrase that became sacred. But history is repeating itself again. A new dictator is terrorizing the whole world. And right now, in this finest hour, Ukraine is defending the West, while the West is afraid to further provoke the dictator. We cannot allow the history to repeat itself. Otherwise, the sacred phrase, never again, will be a shameful reminder that even after the atrocities of Hitler, we have learned nothing. The war with Ukraine will be over, but the history will remember everything. Every war crime against humanity will be prosecuted, justice will be done. In this finest hour, we need to choose to be on the right side of humanity and history. We need to help Ukraine to stop the new Hitler. Thank you. By the way, one of the things that we have been doing to help Ukraine is we have been raising money to supply bulletproof vests and helmets. We already collected more than $10 million that we have. I became a co-chair of one of the Ukrainian American house organizations. And also another things that we've been doing is actually helping children. So we're sponsoring Ukrainian hospital for children, and these are the children that come directly from war lines. They need surgeries, they need help. So we created a GoFund page for them. Our goal is $100,000. We already collected almost half of that. If you guys are interested in donate some money to this charity, to this hospital, my wife is gonna help me to pass by some of these. There is a QR code, just scan it. You can read it about what's going on here. Again, thank you so much for your attention.
I'm very pleased to be part of this panel tonight. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel tonight. Although when we planned what we were going to talk about, we did it about 10 days ago. And the nature of unfolding events means that the course of the war has taken a direction that I really didn't anticipate. As Roman said, the Russians thought they were going to take Kiev in about 3 days. The American army thought that they would take Kiev in about 3 days, and it hasn't happened. And indeed, what has happened in the last 2 days has been a fairly successful counterattack, at least around Kyiv. This is a map from yesterday that appeared in the daily Der Spiegel in Germany today. I find that the Germans are better with their maps than the Americans. So the thought I had when we planned this panel was that if the Ukrainians were losing this war more than they are now, the question would be, what is the ultimate outcome, which struck me as almost inevitably that there would be an extensive insurgency. And it's important for Americans to realize that Ukraine has had a lot of experience with insurgencies in the 20th century. And as a historian of Central and Eastern Europe, I'm primarily a Germanist, in the 19th and 20th century, that's what I want to talk about, but particularly the insurgency in the middle of the 20th century. In September 1939, the Soviets, having reached a deal with the Nazis, agreed to divide interwar Poland, a state that had come back into being in 1919 after not having existed since 1793. On September 17th, the Soviets invaded Poland from the east. Ukrainians had been a large part of the population of interwar Poland, but they had been subject to severe repression, Polonization, by the interwar Polish government. They weren't allowed to speak Ukrainian, to do public school instruction in Ukrainian, and the like. And indeed, in 1930, in eastern Galicia, there was a brutal Polish massacre of Ukrainians. So Ukrainians in Poland didn't want to be there. They wanted an independent Polish, Ukrainian national state. And Western Ukrainians, mostly in exile, in 1929 formed a group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. These were mostly from Eastern Galicia. Some of them had an ideology of leadership similar to Italian fascism. This was a European-wide trend at the time. But the aim was to achieve an independent Ukraine, and to do so by the only measures that powerless people had, which was action which could be characterized as terrorism aimed at the governments in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and the Soviet Union, which were places where Ukrainians lived. We're going to look at some maps here. After the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in March of 1918, an independent Ukrainian state emerged for the first time in a long time. Ukraine had been divided between the Russian Empire and the Commonwealth of Poland and Lithuania until the end of the 18th century. And you can see how far west it stretched in Volhynia, north of Lviv, which of course is in Galicia. After the Soviet-Polish War and after the Soviet Civil War, the western part of Ukraine was lost to Ukraine, and the eastern part became the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And this map reflects that. This is interwar Poland. The Poles had hoped to reestablish the 17th century boundaries of Poland, which, as you can see, included an awful lot of Belarus, but also all of Western Ukraine. When the Soviets invaded Poland in September of 1939, they took back the western part of Ukraine, as well as most of Belarus and the Baltics as well. We could talk about that later. This is another map that shows essentially the same thing. The Soviets also absorbed Bessarabia, the current Moldova, which had been part of interwar Romania as well. Well, the Soviets had made a deal with the devil, and on June 22nd of 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. While much of the advance was in the north, in Belarus and in the Baltics, by 1942, by the end of 1940, the Germans occupied virtually all of Ukraine and extended beyond Ukraine into the Kuban and all the way across to Baku on the Caspian Sea. And they divided this into this Reichskommissariat Ukraine, and Poles, Ukrainians were being oppressed by new oppressors. In 1940, the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, split into two groups. They had differing goals, and Ukrainian nationalism was always plural. You also had Jewish Ukrainian nationalist movements. You had leftist, socialist, communist Ukrainian nationalist movements. These were rightists. And one of them was led by a man named Stepan Bandera. And he and his group, soon after the German invasion, declared independence for a Ukrainian state. And they issued this declaration in German-occupied Lviv. And they pledged their loyalty to Adolf Hitler. But the Nazis didn't want an independent Ukraine. So they rejected and suppressed the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Bandera was first arrested. He ultimately was put into Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He survived and at other times aligned himself more with Nazis, but his goal was always an independent Ukrainian state. By October of 1942, the two fractions formed an insurgent army. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, with the abbreviation of UPA because of the Ukrainian name. Again, this shows you where some of the activity was. A lot of it happens, and we'll look at geographical reasons here from Volhynia down to Subcarpatho-Ruthenia, and there are essentially topographical, geographic reasons for this concentration. By 1943, these insurgents were looking ahead to after the war. And they wanted to preempt the Polish government in exile, which had made clear its hope to reestablish interwar Poland and even to expand it more, which would have put more Ukrainians under the hostile rule of Poles. They wanted to prevent that. So in a mixed territory in the north of Western Ukraine, Volhynia, which was a mixture of Poles and Ukrainians, the UPA began ethnic cleansing. They began relocation of Poles with massive loss of life. Some elements were also anti-Semitic, and there were anti-Jewish pogroms as well, but they also fought against the Nazis. And by 1944, they fought against the Red Army, which was coming back in. These Ukrainians were fighting on all sides. This is a map that shows Volhynia, which is here in the northern part of Western Ukraine. These were significant forces. They were well armed. They were active. They played an important role. These are just some photographs that are readily available in the public domain. After the war, it's not OPA, UPA, that's a typo, I apologize. The struggle against the Soviets for an independent Ukraine extended beyond the end of the war. And beginning in 1949, the CIA supported the UPA in its insurgency in Western Ukraine, sending in radios, weapons, and in hopes of getting intelligence, but also support. The most open insurgency ended by 1951, but it did extend into the 1950s. The last UPA operative was arrested in Donetsk in the east in 1958. And Stepan Bandera was assassinated by the KGB in Munich in 1959. NKVD armies of 35,000 were employed in the early 1950s in order to chase down this Ukrainian insurgent army. And you might ask, how? why, with all the might of the victorious Red Army, this could go on. Well, I want to suggest there's a geographic advantage here. These mountains, the Carpathian Mountains here, are a great place for an insurgency, as well as, and we'll look at some more maps, the Pripyat marshes up in the north, shared between Belarus and Western Ukraine. Again, relief maps show this. This one shows the elevation here in the Carpathians as 1,000 meters or more. Now, those aren't Rockies, those aren't Himalayas, but if you see them, A, they're beautiful, and B, they're wonderful, full of hiding places for insurgents. And here, I'll point out the Pripyat marshes, which go all the way over to Pripyat, which is right outside of, which Chernobyl is right outside of. This is a place where historically insurgent groups can go to hide. Now, it looks like that's not going to be an option that the Ukrainians have to take, at least not immediately. But as part of the lack of discouragement, they know they can do this. They have this in their history, and they know that they have better support now from outside than what the CIA provided in the late 40s and 50s. So, thank you.
Okay, so I guess we're ready for questions. I think we'll set up a mic here in the front, but the room isn't that large. So if you feel like you can, if you have a question, you want to just sort of stand up and ask it, I'll try and direct it to either myself or one of our panelists. Robin.
So I really appreciate all the analysis that you provided, but nobody's really mentioned nuclear weapons, and that's what keeps me up at night. Is if Putin is really cornered, you think he'll resort to nuclear weapons?
I'm going to.
Your department.
Yeah.
Me?
Kelly?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do I need to turn this on?
I don't think so. I think
Hello?
it's picking us up.
Speak if you do it very closely.
Hello?
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay. Probably can project, but okay, so on nuclear, actually, I'm just gonna, no, all right. There we go. All right, so on nuclear weapons, that's the reason we're not seeing direct military involvement from NATO, US, and Europe. So in that sense, it's been very much under discussion. There have been recent developments in preparation for possible nuclear attacks or also biological chemical attacks. That was covered a lot in the press today. So President Biden has established this Tiger team to try to figure out help avoid that and help Ukraine and Europe prepare for attacks like that. And NATO is doing the same thing. I think what's the likeliest nuclear approach to be taken by the Russian regime at this point would be a small, limited nuclear attack within Ukraine. The idea is that if Putin feels, I guess two things. So if Putin feels and his advisors feel that they are really losing the war using conventional forces in Ukraine, and if he doesn't see a way out of the war, kind of a face-saving, regime-saving approach, that he may use a limited nuclear attack in Ukraine. I think as worrisome as that, and maybe even more likely, is a nuclear accident in Ukraine. So that's something to keep your eye on too, and that is something that Europe is preparing for as well, a fallout cloud heading over the rest of Europe. In terms of good news, well, one more piece of bad news. You may have also seen in the press that US top military officials have not been able to reach top Russian military officials. And that's really important to prevent inadvertent escalation. To end on a positive note, the back channel, lower level military communications are continuing between the US and Russia. And a lot of that infrastructure is designed to make sure there's not an accidental nuclear escalation. And from what I've heard, that is still operational. So that's good news. So Robin, hopefully the little piece of good news will help you sleep at night. If I can just say a personal thing, I actually became a political scientist and started my career studying the former Soviet Union because of my fear as a middle school student of nuclear war. So I was in middle school when Ronald Reagan was in office and used the rhetoric about the evil empire. And I lost a lot of sleep worried that that was going to escalate to a nuclear conflict. So it's sort of feels like it's come full circle. So just a personal anecdote. Thanks for your question.
If I may add to this, so I actually, through back channels of Telegram and other social media accounts, I'm actually able to watch Russian propaganda pretty much every other day or every day. And so they do talk about nuclear strikes all the time. And they are talking about them in the way of a preventive strikes against London, against New York, Washington, Chicago, San Francisco. All these cities come up pretty much every day in US news. But as somebody who studies game theory and somebody who analyzes this, nuclear threat is a very powerful threat. But once the nuclear weapon is used, it's useless. So that's the thing. Putin has a very strong bargaining chip while he didn't use the nuclear weapon. Because, so my point is, once he uses nuclear weapon, even in Ukraine, that's why I do believe that the likelihood of that scenario is so little that we should not lose our sleep over that. Because once he uses that, he loses everything. He gains nothing. Because the world will have to step in and destroy. His regime will fall. His legacy is going to be completely demolished. Everything that he worked for, he's going to be the villain of humanity for all times. I mean, that's not the picture that he wants to portray for himself. And again, the response will be, it will have to be to demilitarize now Russia and destroy these nuclear facilities. Because otherwise, I mean, what's next? Where do we stop? And so my point is that he should, and also as far as the implementing the nuclear strike, it's not the red button. There's no red secret button in Russia where he presses and it just fires. There's going to be hundreds of people that need to be involved in executing this order, including people actually launching. And half of those nuclear weapons that don't even work. They're still from the, you know, it's a great threat and it's powerful as a threat. Once it's used, it loses completely its power. So my point is that I really would assign such an insignificant small probability that it's just extremely unlikely scenario. But I do agree that the response of the West has to be to put on full alert and to say that we are prepared for even threat like this. And that's why, you know, I think that the response of NATO has been fairly reasonable, saying, hey, we're going to put all these anti-aircraft, anti-missile systems on alert around the world. So that's, yeah.
I'll just chip in 2 seconds, which is that I think that the fact that there's never been a use of a nuclear weapon in a kind of battlefield circumstance before means that we don't really know what the response of anyone would be if one were used. And one would hope that it wouldn't escalate to a sort of more general exchange, strategic exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union and Russia, because that would be, you know, a catastrophe, and so one that everyone wants to avoid. But by the same token, that makes everyone wants to avoid that. Then does one nuclear weapon count? How about detonating a a hydrogen bomb over the Arctic Ocean as a demonstration. I mean, these are things that one could do without, that would be terrorizing, but probably not trigger a sort of a massive response from the West.
Robin, as a historian, I'll wait until it happens and I'll explain it after.
I've taught American history forever. In the 50s, we had the consensus. Sorry, the Russians were the baddies. Well, in the 50s, it was, you know, we were probably nobody's perfect. But everyone's Democrat, they're also conservative. And then we get into this polarization of the 60s, which is returning more vengeance. But in the late 60s, we began to get the take that like Truman had been waving his atom bomb around when he met Stalin when he first found out that he had the bomb, and suddenly we were the aggressor as opposed to the Russians. I had these nightmares about being kidnapped by Ethel and Julius Rosenberg and Ethel, but and we had our bomb, so it was pretty scary. But so, I mean, Putin is obviously obsessed, and he's maintaining that this is all because of NATO expanding, and he's going to push more and more on the defensive. And I'm wondering, is that a realistic neurosis on his part, or could that have been handled better in the post-collapse of the Soviet Union? It seems to be one of the big issues.
So definitely, yeah. So definitely, maybe Kelly first, and then Ken.
So in the after the collapse of the Soviet Union, NATO changed in two ways. One is it expanded in terms of membership, and the other is that its mission expanded too. Some people consider that its mission expanded. I don't think there was an alternative to expanding the membership. These countries that joined had just escaped under the mantle of the Soviet Union. They were afraid of Russia as an aggressor and losing the progress they'd made, in many cases through mass demonstrations, losing the progress with reintegration of the rest of the world, political freedoms, economic freedoms. So I think it's understandable to me why earlier members of NATO were welcoming of those countries that were emerging from the collapsed East Bloc. Some people have been critical of what they view as Russia's expansion of its mission. So the idea that a threat to NATO includes widespread immigration, a refugee movement toward Europe. And that was the concern, as I understand it, that led to NATO involvement in other areas, in Yugoslavia, in North Africa, that if those areas were destabilized, even though those weren't NATO countries, that there would be so many people pouring into Europe. It's ironic now because that is happening. We have nearly 3.5 million Ukrainians who've left, many of whom have gone only as far as Europe. But that rationale, that new mission isn't being invoked as a justification for expanding NATO support. So I don't necessarily think that expansion of mission was a bad thing personally, but that is an argument out there. And I think it would be very hard to criticize the expansion of membership. I mean, that seems like a justifiable thing to do at the end of the Cold War.
And if I could speak to that in two historical contexts. First, I think the expansion was really driven by the three Baltic states, who, especially in Cleveland, we know that they had led the captive nations lobby in the United States ever since they were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 and 40. as part of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and their continued possession by the Soviet Union was conceded and not rolled back. And this actually roiled US politics even in the 1950s. But as I understand it too, Putin is being accused lots of times in the American press of being crushed by the fall of the Soviet Union, the decline of the Soviet Union, and blaming the Ukrainians from 1991 for that, and wanting to reestablish the Soviet Union. But he surrounded himself with people who are steeped in sort of a mystic pan-Slavist thought that really dates to the 19th century. And I think you can argue much more that he is aiming at reestablishing the Russian Empire, which again would include the Baltics, it would include Poland, and it certainly would include all of Ukraine. And Belarus, again, because of its autocratic, its absence of two Maidans, is going along with this and is cooperating in the enterprise against Ukraine. But I think you've got to look at this in a longer sense, and it's most obviously clear because of his reliance on the hierarchy of the Russian Orthodox Church. That's not a Soviet thing, that's a Russian imperial thing.
I have a question for Dr. Sheremeta. I was born in the 1955. So we emigrated to exactly the same kind of process that's happening now. I listened and watched Ukrainian television on YouTube. And I believe that public opinion is very much influenced by the press. What I'm curious about is, there's a difference between what's reported in the Western press, and I watch CNN, MSNBC, as opposed to what I hear on the Ukrainian television station, which is far more optimistic, far more positive, although very realistic, showing all those pictures that you showed on the screen. But they also talk about what's happening in education. How are we distributing pharmaceuticals? What are we doing about elderly populations? How are we handling humanitarian corridors? What's happening with Mariupol, and how are we getting access to those people or not? They have local journalists throughout the entire country who report on what's happening, and not all of Ukraine looks like those things. And I find that so upsetting and so demoralizing that I'm going to write to Ukraine 24. I was hoping I could write to CNN and say, you guys need to talk to Ukraine 24 and
Yes.
get this into coverage, because what we get here is just bombed buildings running
Right.
in a loop. And I was glad to hear you with a much more positive kind of approach.
So absolutely, and I completely agree with you on this assessment. So basically, the complaint, those of you couldn't hear, is that what we hear on our press, on our TV, actually quite different than what we hear from the Ukrainians who are actually on the ground. Even though the reality hits them really hard there, but they also have a much more optimistic view on a lot of things. And 2 weeks ago, I was in DC and I met with Oksana Markarova, our ambassador, and we spoke about this issue of lack of representation on the national TV in the US of Ukrainians, or either Ukrainians who've been in Kiev or in Lviv or on the ground. And instead of listening to the experts on Ukraine who speak on behalf of Ukrainians, let the people speak for themselves. And that's why, most of my time these days have been with the press. I've spoken to ABC, CBN, NBC, Fox News, and all of the major press outlets to be that voice. But there's hundreds and thousands like us making sure that we're presenting a more, more holistic picture, because the picture is such that Ukrainian people are not going to give up. They're very monolithic. They understand the cost. They're not optimistic in terms of the cost. They understand how many lives will be paid for this price, but they know that they're not going to give up. So anybody in the West who says, well, what will happen if Ukraine gives up? I'm telling you, they're not going to give up. I'm a Ukrainian. I know my family. I know the resolve of people. Yes, they will die. A lot of them will die, but they're not going to give up. So that's the question. The question is, how many lives is it going to cost for the West to react more, aggressively and help Ukraine to defeat Russia, at least in Ukraine? We're not talking about offensive going into Russia. We're talking about kicking them out of the Ukrainian borders. And so that's, and you're right, there's so much unity, people that work together to make this a success story, that we will see a lot of Netflix movies, we will see a lot of Amazon and Hollywood movies about this in the future. I just hope that this will be with less casualties.
And you're also focusing on the future.
That's right. Absolutely.
Zelensky today said he's talked to Swedes. He's working with them to come in and rebuild. This is a very different attitude from saying, well, we don't know if we're going to win.
Let me tell you one story, just one story quickly. So I was there a day before Russia started bombing. So the day before Russia started bombing, I actually came to the United States by an accident, but I flew to Cleveland to see my wife and family. I was planning to go back in a week. I didn't expect the Russia would attack. I had faculty that I was working with to open American University Kiev, American faculty that agreed to come and work in Ukraine. The future dean of the school is an American. And he said, I can maximum commit 1 year of my life in Ukraine. After this incident, he said he's coming for 3 years. The university is still gonna open up. David has been asking me if I'm actually gonna consider to stay in Cleveland because I'm taking a leave of absence to open up this university. And I told him that, no, we still have all the plans. And in fact,
I'm just being selfish.
Yeah, the result is even greater. So you're absolutely right. Absolutely right.
I'd just like to share 2 dates on this perpetual marrying of 2 different ethnicities of Russians and Ukrainians. Kyiv was founded in 482. Muscovy was founded in 1147. 665 years later. So number 2, I have a question, and it's a philosophical one. And I'd like to know from the experts here on whether the view of Ukraine from a Western perspective has changed in the context of this question. How important, in the deepest meaning and significance of the word important, how important is a strong, free, independent, thriving nation, democratic, of 45 million? How important is that to the United States and to the rest of the countries of Western Europe, besides being just a buffer where people go to die to protect Western interests? We've become a culture of the man on the corner by the pharmacy getting beat up on the ground, and you have bystanders standing and watching him get beat, and maybe even someone pulling a cell phone out to videotape it. So we have a paralysis of fear in the West. at the highest levels, the diplomats, the vice presidents, or the presidents, it's typically done this way. The sergeant at arms, the attaché of both countries, they stand and they say, don't you dare go there. That has not been done to Mr. Putin in this case. We keep backstepping, backpedaling in the weakness of no moral imperative to stand up and punch the guy in the nose. Plans change immediately. And the West hasn't done that. I respect your opinion of the let's show an example bomb. Is this what you want? We are weak, and we have no moral responsibility in this year of 2022. So let's have a genocide continue. This is a genocide. When you have ambulances with sick people being blown up by tanks, that's genocide. So we need to be confident that we have the moral side. Ukrainians are confident that they will win. That's why they're fighting. But the West is truly, truly, pathetically weak. Back to that question of how truly important is a strong, independent, free, and democratic Ukraine to the West and to Europe. And are we just using it for our own purposes? Who wants to take that one on?
I will take it.
Do you want to take it first?
I'll start first. I mean, I'm Ukrainian by birth. I'm a citizen of Ukraine and citizen of the United States. A child of two worlds. Got my education there and got my education here. Worked there and worked here. So I'm biased, obviously. For me, it's one of the most important questions of my life. You know, I came here to the United States because of the freedom, the liberties, the opportunities, the democracy, everything the United States stands for. And I did believe that we are standing for this, and we will do everything to make sure that this is what happens in the rest of the world, you know, and I've been disappointed. I've been disappointed by the United States, by the President of the United States, by the government, by Republican, and by the Democrat. I've been disappointed. And for me, it's also the matter of survival of my parents, of my uncle, of my cousins, of the vice president of my university that I'm going to be working at, who is right now been enlisted in the army to defend Ukraine. The vice president of the University of American University of Kiev. So for me, it's always been important. But now it's the question of existence, of my morality, my philosophy of life, of everything. So again, I'm biased. I think it's the most important question that is today on the table.
So thank you for your question, your comments. I understand your anger and your frustration. I think looking at this just analytically to try to understand why we're not seeing more Western support. Western leaders are elected by their publics, and they're not going to take action that they feel is going to put their public at risk. And whether accurate or not, there's the concern about a nuclear response from Russia. I'm hopeful too that there will be, I am hopeful that there will be a stronger response from the West. But if we look at history, there have been so many tragedies, so many moral imperatives for the US and in general affluent democracies to get involved. And time again, they have not, because of security interest and also economic interest. And the economic interest is very much evidenced by the fact that Europeans are not willing to immediately cut off their purchasing of Russian oil and natural gas. Again, these are elected leaders. They're responsible to their publics, and in their calculation, the economic and everyday discomfort of their population is outweighing the horror that's occurring in Ukraine. So that's just my cold analytical explanation, not my personal view. But I think that's how we understand what's going on. And it also, looking back at history, it makes me not hopeful that we're going to see a stronger Western response.
We don't talk about the benefits of globalism and all the benefits and how wonderful it will be. But the globalism we talk about is economic only. It has nothing to do with being a loving community of human beings.
If I could make
Yeah.
two observations, and I share your frustration in many, many ways, even as I recognize the hard, cold calculus that Professor McMann identifies. The analogy, obviously, and you see this in the press everywhere, is to the Munich Agreement of 1938. And that is actually a phenomenon that historians agree is fundamentally misunderstood by most political scientists and policymakers, because Britain was simply not ready to go to war. The public opinion in September of 1938, public opinion was opposed to it. The army wasn't ready. The Spitfires and Hurricanes and radar were not yet online. But in the spring of 1939, the very same Neville Chamberlain who had made the Munich Agreement gave an unconditional unilateral guarantee of Poland and said that he was authorized to speak for the French government as well, which the French government had not authorized him to speak for them, and thus bound France to that. And when Hitler attacked Poland, Britain went to war. That's a rare occurrence. The learning curve of the American public about Ukraine outside the realm of Ukrainian Americans and places like Cleveland, which have lively Ukrainian American communities, is really small. I'm from North Carolina. People in North Carolina, unless they've moved there from Cleveland or happen to have gotten there from Ukraine or someplace, couldn't tell you what the difference between Ukraine and Belarus and Russia are, but they know now. They're watching the heroism that they're seeing every night, and that's the narrative. This is cold comfort to your uncle and to your worry about your uncle and to your relatives and to your home cities. But I do believe that it is an iterative process, and the British public changed its mind. I don't subscribe to the Winston Churchill changed their minds. Winston Churchill followed the British public because Neville Chamberlain was the one that led them into war. And it was the British public that saw what Hitler was doing, and they changed their minds. Ukraine has bought itself enough time that I hope that the minds can be changed in time to benefit Ukraine.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So you're saying NATO will be ready soon?
Well, there was sort of a joke. There was a flippant remark that Putin in 2 weeks changed the neutrality of Sweden, Finland, and Switzerland, and the pacifism of Germany. They're still buying the gas, but they're putting $100 billion with a B euros in 1 year in addition to their military budget. Now, there are a lot of Europeans who still, for valid historical reasons, may be uncomfortable seeing Germany with an army that big. But, and I would never challenge anybody who challenged that. But that is a change in German public opinion. This was a social democrat who did it. That, in my career as a German observer, rivals the fall of the Berlin Wall for the unexpected event in German history I've seen.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for tonight. It's been great. Much appreciated. We've seen interviews with people in Europe and the States who have friends and family in Russia. And we've seen interviews that are saying the folks in Russia aren't believing the information that they're hearing. And my question is, that repression by Putin's administration and combined with the sanctions, is there any chance that a segment of the Russian population will actually galvanize and Putin will gain support as a result, even if it's a smaller segment of the population?
I'll start and say that I think that either could happen, and I think that the degree of control that that Putin has over the media and over a sort of potentially very strong apparatus of repression means that just because people suffer doesn't mean that they are going to be able to marshaled in the streets to a degree that's great enough to threaten him.
Yeah, by the way, I second that. I don't see the way that the Russians would do the same thing that Ukrainians did in Maidan, so they're different people. And the amount of propaganda and the control of the media, it cannot be overstated. And by the way, this is one reason why I think that the cutting Russia from Facebook, Instagram, YouTube might play a negative role.
That's kind of my
Yeah, I actually do think that despite all of the propaganda and all of the junk that we have been seeing coming from the troll farms from Russia, at least something has been going through. Today, it's they listen to the poison. If you've seen the Hunger Games or read the books, this is exactly what it is. It's the complete control of the mind of the person through only one media channel, and that is through the TV. The latest thing that I saw 2 days ago is that United States has helped Ukrainian to develop birds that will be flying to Russia and delivering biological weapons. And majority, 90% of people believe that's true.
And that's kind of my question in terms of, will there be a segment of the Russian population actually support that, galvanize and support it?
I think so. There's a pretty good chance, but as David said, things could happen.
So I wanted to respond directly to your question about the likelihood of increased support for Putin. So far, we haven't seen it. We usually see a rally around the flag effect when there's an external military activity by a country. And we still have, there still is in Russia a polling service that seems to be able to operate freely. And we didn't see a boost in his popularity ratings among the Russian public. The Russian public, as of a few months ago, about 60% did support the Russian military intervention in Ukraine, but that phrase is key. That's what the survey had to use. So that was continuing the disinformation that it was not a war. But I think the key point is we haven't seen an increase in popularity. And I think the disinformation campaign and any feeling of misplaced pride about fighting Nazis in Ukraine or anything like that. All that false information could easily be outweighed by economic suffering. And one thing that David didn't directly address is while the economic ramifications in Russia may not occur for a while, some of the bigger ones, Russians are experiencing immediate economic difficulties. Now, in the context of what Ukrainians are experiencing in the East, this is nothing, but keep in mind for a Russian who's not seeing the war, suddenly their credit cards don't work. Suddenly they can't withdraw money from their bank. Suddenly they can no longer get the products they were getting externally. So Russians' perspective may change because of these, what are now minor economic hardships or relatively minor. So that could outweigh the disinformation campaign. Just wanted to say a little bit more about the disinformation campaigns. So the remaining sources of, or remaining possible sources of accurate information are through Telegram, the popular social media site in that region of the world, and also through YouTube. Those haven't been shut down yet. It's still possible, if you're aware of VPN technology, to use that to go and directly, read the BBC online or something like that. I think the main problem is that the Russians who were sort of part of the international elite and were incentivized to get accurate information, especially in the last 10 years of Putin's regime, as accurate information has dried up, many of them have left the country. But to try to end on a positive note, since 2014, when Russia invaded and took control of Crimea and started to support more explicitly the separatists in eastern Ukraine, general Russian population viewership of the percentage of people who relied on television news in Russia for their news, and it was only state controlled by that point, dropped from 90% to 66% today. So people were looking for accurate information. I think this means also they were already suspect, or maybe it was the news got boring. I don't know. But anyway, so people were searching for other information. So perhaps there's still a significant portion of people left in Russia who will continue to try to do that.
So I'll add two yeah, so that was so you can have propaganda all the way until your son or husband comes home dead, or they come home and tell you that they were sent into a war that they were not told that they were going to, and that they had no support and no organization, and all of their friends are dead. That's something, doesn't matter what appears on TV. And, maybe it's only 40 or 50,000 people in a nation of 150 million, but you don't have to be directly affected to learn about it. You start to see new amputees walking down the street, and who has lost a child, and that may take a long time to penetrate, but it won't. I think it will create skepticism, at least. Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point. Unfortunately, the Russian regime thought of that in advance too. So shortly before the invasion, a law was passed allowing Russians who died in the battlefield to be buried in mass graves and not returned home. And we're seeing evidence of Russian soldiers. I'm sure you've read this in the press. Russian soldiers are being left on the battlefield, not even buried. Now, obviously, people are still going to realize that their children or spouse didn't come home. But the other thing that's going on, it does remove the whole visual of the bodies being returned to the country, the funerals being held, right? So that's true. And I don't mean to minimize death by calling that a visual, but I think you understand what I mean, right? But the other thing that's happened is the repression has grown so severe against civic organizations in Russia that the civic organizations that helped end the war or helped with convince Soviet leaders to pull out of Afghanistan, these organizations of mothers who were unhappy, were distressed with their sons going to fight in Afghanistan, with their sons returning home dead, those organizations and those types of movements have just been completely eradicated. And also the level of disinformation is so great. It is possible that some of those mothers may think my son died a patriotic death because he was fighting the Nazis. There will be some people who believe that too. Sorry to be so negative, but I just want everyone to understand that the Russian regime has actually thought this part through too. So
There were.
This is a question for the economists.
Oh, okay.
I'm interested in, if you thought about the knock-on effects, the third and fourth order ripple effects of this whole thing that we'll see 5-10 years out, or maybe even in the shorter term. So you've got a problem with food because wheat's going crazy. You've got a problem with making semiconductors with the neon. Nickel's gone wacko. What are some of the knock-on effects that you think might come out of this whole thing? And I'd be especially interested in having thoughts about implications with respect to China. I keep wondering if China will, somehow support, and then that drags them into the fry up.
Yeah, so they have to, they have to, I guess, tread very, very carefully because they, on the one hand, want to be seen as an orderly authoritarian state. And, what Russia is doing is something maybe they don't want to be associated with, but also, they, also we're interested in Russia being maybe a kind of weaker sort of client state of theirs. I think that the shortages and so forth, they'll cause some disruption over a 5-year period or something like that, and then we will sort of adjust and we will be able to sort of live without them. They won't be able to live nearly as well without us, probably. The longer term effects that I'm not sure that I worry about them, but I think, at least I don't worry about them in the context of what is happening right now, but the possibility of kind of a more general stepping back from economic integration is possible. Whether that's a good or a bad thing is unclear, a little unclear to me. I feel like the conflict is causing me to rethink a lot of opinions I had about the sort of relationship of economics and politics. In a way that I sort of appreciate this, the feeling that maybe we've just been sleepwalking since 1993, from the perspective of Westerners. The Soviet Union stopped being a communist state, and we thought that that was the transformation. And it did stop being a communist state, but it doesn't seem to have stopped being an imperial state, or stopped being the Russian state. And so that makes me, I guess, feel less sure than I might about how things are going to sort of flow from here. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your question. Even though I'm not an economist, I wanted to weigh in on the part of your question about China. So one concern is that China would basically replace or try to replace Russia's trading partners, other financial partners, as Russia faced international economic sanctions. And so far that hasn't happened. China's not providing substantial economic aid and also not military aid to China. Nothing new is happening on that front. China is disseminating the same propaganda that Russia is. So most recently about the biowarfare factories, joint US, Ukrainian ones on Ukrainian soil, things like that are happening. But China's in a difficult position because of its ideology. So on the one hand, it's always been very protective of sovereignty because there are claims on its territory. So it wants to oppose Russia for that reason. On the other hand, the Chinese government, and also I think genuinely, at least part of the Chinese public, is very happy to see Russia, stand up to the West. So China's kind of caught between these two different inclinations. I think it's also important to note that China actually has a pretty significant economic stake in what's happening. And that is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has disrupted China's northern plans for its Belt and Roads Initiative, which is its global economic initiative, just disrupted that northern route, but nonetheless relatively significant for China.
Yeah, in the back, and then. Oh, okay, go ahead, sir. Yeah.
Professor McMann briefly touched on over 3 million Ukrainian citizens that have left the country. As of 2 days ago, I read that 2.1 million are in Poland. How, I have to imagine that's very taxing on the Polish government right now. And how, and I'm guessing the number will continue to grow. So how can we expect Poland to continue to support the refugees, the people coming from Ukraine, and what will the West do to support that? How much will they support it, and when will they support it? Just as a side note, I saw that President Biden said, well, we'll take 100,000.
Yeah.
100,000 versus 2.1 million.
If I could take a first shot at that, and Poland's not the worst of it. Somewhere in the cloud, a student of ours who graduated last May was in holding a Fulbright fellowship in Chisinau, Moldova, when this happened, and she was advised by the Fulbright people to go to Bucharest. So she's in Romania now, but she points out that in percentage of total population, Moldova has more than 10% of its original population consisting of Ukrainian refugees right now. But for Poland in particular, there is an EU structure for this now that was not in place in 2015 and 16, but was constructed and is working. Those people are being put on trains in Przemyśl, and they're coming, they're in Berlin. The entire basement of the Hauptbahnhof in Berlin is a refugee center. And then Germany has had a plan since the expulsions in the late 1940s to distribute these people to the German federal states. And Germany has activated that plan. I haven't seen a number for Ukrainian refugees who will be distributed, but the state capacity of the European Union and particularly of Germany to do this is quite high. And so I don't believe that Poland is going to bear this alone. At a minimum, they're going to get teams coming in from other EU states and EU money to help offset the cost. But these refugees, for as long as they want to stay, will be distributed through the European Union. Although the refugees, like all refugees, only want to go home. And they want to have a home that's a safe place to return to.
As a follow-up to that, historically, I have no idea. What
percentage typically go back home?
It's really variable. And a lot of it depends on what the conditions are. And those conditions are multiple levels. What's the physical condition? Nobody's going to be able to go home to Mariupol for a long time. It takes a long time, if the war stopped today, to rebuild all the buildings that were destroyed, to rebuild all the businesses where people worked and earned their livelihoods. That's going to take some time. After the Second World War, there was less return home because of the political divide. And the Allies had agreed that displaced persons would be returned to their home states, and nobody from the Soviet Union wanted to go back because they knew what awaited them there even before Solzhenitsyn got to write novels about it. So we had terrible scenes in the late 40s of Ukrainians who had been resistance fighters being forcibly repatriated to the Soviet Union to a terrible fate. It's hard to generalize. The second thing is you sink roots. You sink roots in the place in which you find refuge. You get a job. If you're single, you may wind up with a partner. If you're widowed, you may wind up with a partner. And then you have personal ties that render a return a very problematic prospect. It's hard to generalize, and I'm a historian, so I can say impossible to predict. No, that's the economists. We need the one-handed economists.
Okay, 1 sec, and then
Yeah.
just another comment here.
So while Ken was talking, I wasn't being rude. I was trying to find a number for you. So the Biden administration, in addition to announcing allowing 100,000 refugees from Ukraine into the US, also provided a significant sum to Europe for refugee assistance. The number looked very big to me. I can't find it. I think it was 1 billion, but I'm not sure. So part of that sending money, taking a small number of refugees, is US politics, but part of it is, I think, a genuinely good strategy of keeping Ukrainians close to their homeland. It's important that they're able to return as soon as possible. Also, the first wave of Ukrainians who left had family members living in Europe, so they're in a good situation. The second wave we just saw recently, they don't have family members in Europe. Maybe some of them have them in the US. So obviously the 100,000 will be important. I got it right. Ken just showed me 1 billion for refugee assistance in Europe. Anyway, so the 100,000 places for Ukrainian refugees with a focus on family connections will be really helpful. But at the same time, it's important to keep, I think the strategy of keeping Ukrainians close to Ukraine so that they can return quickly is really useful. I'm also wondering whether we could see an early return to Western Ukraine if the Ukrainian resistance and the Ukrainian military is able to keep that under control, whether people would start coming back even if Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine continue to face fighting.
Well, like the whole Ukrainian families didn't leave, right? A lot of women, children.
Yeah, the men stayed.
The men couldn't leave. Women couldn't leave.
Right.
18 to 60. One of them got back.
And in Rio, there's so many that are have
Yeah.
stopped.
Back.
So not to be separate from Ukraine, but I'm just wondering why part of the narrative around what's happening times to messaging is having this this message that peace has been in Europe since World War II up until now, and talking about refugees, and I think the Balkans are not discussed whatsoever.
Yeah.
And what happened in Yugoslavia, and I mean, that was from 91 to 2000. So when our president says decades, it's really been, I mean, if this started in 2014, it's really been just over a decade. So I just wanted.
I mean, Well, you know, I don't want to go Bismarck and start talking about the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier, but I think that what is different here is that it is a former superpower, a world power, and it's not the dissolution of a state. The state was dissolved 30 years ago, and now the sovereign border was violated. And it's that Westphalian sense of the violation of the sovereign border. When Milosevic launched the war against Croatia, the dissolution of Yugoslavia was still going on. The whole Kosovo issue was a place that was only an autonomous region within Serbia. It wasn't a constituent republic of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So I think that's the distinction. In terms of lives and deaths, it doesn't make any difference. In terms of the fact that there were troops on the ground and people dying, it doesn't make any difference. But I think there's a legal an international law / diplomatic difference that justifies that statement.
I also think that there's a way in which this is sort of this conflict more clearly kind of connects to the sort of existential threats that Europeans worried about, right, from 1945 to the present, in a way that the Yugoslav conflict didn't really plug into in the same way.
Germany didn't increase its military budget to participate in Kosovo, although it was the first place they sent German troops outside of Germany since 1945. But they recognize this as something different in kind, different in scale.
I guess I'm saying more of the grandiose aspect. Europe and excluding the Balkans in this way. There's like this idea, oh, it can't happen in Europe. Well, this just seems unfeasible. And yet this has been happening, what you were saying, in a way, kind of says, well, is it part of Europe? Or is it the stepchild?
There's no question there's an Orientalist aspect in Western Europe toward the Balkans that Bismarck personified with his crack about not being worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier. But the contrast of the last 80 years with the previous 30 years in European history is extremely dramatic, as I'm finishing up teaching my course on the history of World War I this semester. So.
Yeah.
You guys can go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you for putting tonight together. I really appreciate your individual knowledge and critical analysis of different aspects of the conflict. Question, and it kind of piggybacks off of the question about propaganda. I think we all can acknowledge how cluttered and chaotic and biased, not just social media, but the media in general can be. I just want to know, you all have any recommendations on news outlets or news sources, for the purpose of both keeping up with current events on the conflict and also keeping up and learning about prior conflicts to give context to what's happening today.
Can I make one quick suggestion, which is not news related? I think everybody who hasn't read it needs to read Sergei Plokhy's The Gates of Europe, which is a 1-volume history of Ukraine from the beginning through 2014. It was 2019. He is SERHIIPLOKHII. He holds the chair of Ukrainian history at Harvard. I'm panicking on his name. Tim Tim Snyder at Yale.
Yale.
Tim Snyder at Yale has a lot of individual articles. I drew a lot from Snyder's articles in what I talked about tonight, but you cannot do better than the Plochy volume for a 1-volume history for someone who knows nothing about Ukraine.
So Tim Snyder's, 2 books of his, one is Road to Unfreedom, which has a lot about Ukraine in it, and was kind of couched as a sort of American politics, Russian politics in Ukraine, but it actually has, I think, a lot on how Putin operates and how the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass started. His book Bloodlands, which is about Ukraine as a sort of a site of battle between the Soviets and the Germans during the Second World War, related to genocide, is very good. Kind of an essential one. On sort of news sources, one thing that I've found very valuable recently are the intelligence podcast from The Economist, the Daily podcast from the New York Times, and the BBC World Service podcasts, all of which have tended to have longer and more in-depth interviews with Ukrainian people on the ground. And I found it to give me a lot more context on sort of individual experience. And I think that's, as the conflict kind of events are happening maybe a little bit slower than before, I think that's a kind of valuable way of deepening understanding. Yeah.
My advice would be, so I dealt with that problem quite extensively, and my recommendation as far as media, I would recommend you not to go to the extremes, far left or far right. So for example, as a principal, I don't listen to Fox News and CNN. This is just something that I do as a principal because I know that they will be biased in their own. More centric news would be better. NPR is a good outlet to start with. But then also, what I would recommend when you want to learn something about the conflict, first of all, follow the academic people like Serhiy Plochy, like Timothy Snyder. Follow them on Twitter, follow them on LinkedIn, follow them on Facebook, whatever social media you use, academic people in general, because we tend to think a little bit more analytically and we are more skeptical of media overall. So following academics. And the third thing I would recommend, follow the journalists who are covering the stories on the ground. So basically somebody who is covering the story right now in Ukraine, they can give you a list of, 20 journalists, and because they constantly encounter people, and those are the stories really that you need to hear, or photographers also who are taking photos, they share the first-hand experience. And so those are much more reliable sources of information. And besides the official, reports from the governments.
Kelly has one to add.
So along the lines of what Roman was saying about academics, I wanted to recommend a specific source. It's a website, or the way to access the information would be for you all would be through a website. It's called PONARS. It's PONARS, Eurasia. So this is a network of about 100 scholars based all throughout Eurasian countries. The former East Bloc countries, what we used to refer to as Western Europe, and the US. So they're scholars, Ukrainian scholars who've remained in the country. They're Russian scholars who've remained in the country. And I will mention that the Russian scholars are not in support of the regime. They have access to lots of information, and they're critical of the regime. Anyway, so I'm part of PONARS as well. What we've been doing is each day there's a selection of 3 questions about the war in Ukraine, and thinking about the war broadly, and some experts will provide answers to them. So that's a quick read of expert analysis, really interesting different topics. One reoccurring question is, what are we not talking about that we should be? So that brings up really interesting answers as well. We also did a 24-hour Ukraine-a-thon. So if you want to watch 24 hours worth of 10-minute talks about the war, we did this last week and it's now available as a recording if you prefer to listen then instead of read or do both. Thank you.
So do we, I guess we're sort of at, we're at 9:15 now. So, and thank you. Yeah, we should let everyone go home, I guess, but thank you so much for the insightful sort of questions
your
and
great
comments.
questions.
Yeah, fantastic
Thank you.
questions. And